Hello and welcome to The Drama. I'm Tim Palmer. Coming up, Australians flee Cairo ahead of the million-man march. Could this be the turning point? The federal government ready to take on the states over pokies reform, and why Australian voters aren't hearing Julia Gillard's message on the flood levy. Our panel tonight, Tom Switzer from the United States Study Centre, lawyer and broadcaster Cara Greiner, and Peter Lewis from Essential Media. Welcome all to The Drum. Well, Australians have started fleeing Egypt on Canadian evacuation flights as the protests against President Mubarak's regime continue. Hundreds more are waiting to leave on a Qantas plane chartered by the federal government, due to arrive in Cairo tomorrow. 10,000 protesters are reported to have broken the curfew overnight, staying in Tahrir Square through the night, and thousands more have already gathered there in the early hours of this morning, ahead of what protest organisers are calling a march of millions later today. Islam Najjar is a former member of the Al-Watf party who now lives in Australia. He says Islamic groups like the Muslim Brotherhood aren't the obvious successors to the Mubarak government.
The Muslim Brotherhood do exist in the streets in Egypt, but they're less likely to get the majority from the people. They are part of the society, yes, but they are not the majority. And the Muslim Brotherhood is not just one entity. There are different sections inside them. There is very extremist people, neutral people, and very open people, up to the point that they can accept a woman as a leader of Egypt.
Well, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who's now a Middle East envoy for the international community, says that political change in Egypt is now inevitable.
The question is what type of change and how do we get there? And the essence of it is that we get to a situation where the will of the people is expressed in proper elections, but that is done in circumstances where there's stability, there's order, there's not a disruption of the wider process, for example, here in between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and where, if you like, those elections are able to express the will of the people because there are proper functioning political parties taking part.
Well, Tom Switzer, you've written an article today about be careful what you wish for in terms of change in Egypt. A march of millions today, but so far the demonstrations have been the property of urban Egyptians, typically more secular, more liberal. There might be the religious fundamentalist among them, but more liberal than most of the country. But if there were to be a free and fair election in Egypt, it's going to be decided by the 60 or 70 million rural villages in Egypt, isn't it? Where might that leave us?
Well, we don't know, but I think it's wise not to rush to judgment. I mean, I've been struck in the course of the last few days, if you look at a lot of the American and British and indeed some Australian political commentary on this episode, the sneering of stability, that somehow stability has been a bad thing in the Middle East. It's not perfect. I mean, I think most Australians, most Americans, I presume a lot of Egyptians, would ideally like a liberal democratic government in Cairo instead of the repressive and authoritarian regime we've had all too often in Middle Eastern politics. But that's not the issue. The issue is what happens next. Presuming that Mubarak himself tumbles or there's a dramatic transfer of power to who knows what, the question is how you deal with that order. And I think one of the lessons we've learnt from the last 8 years in both Iraq and Afghanistan, democracy is not an export commodity, but more importantly, it's a do-it-yourself enterprise, but it requires very special circumstances and conditions. And I'm not convinced that the circumstances and conditions right now in Egypt are ripe for a democracy.
Well, certainly it's a bit of a crucible. Some of the live pictures there on television from Cairo as the thousands gather at Tahrir Square. You're right that it's surely simplistic to denounce Cairo for denying democracy to the Egyptian people. What if elections brought to power jihadists and terrorist supporters such as the Muslim Brotherhood? But what if, Tom Switzer? I mean, it looks like you're saying that, democracy would be terrific at a certain level, but if we can't be certain that it's our team that gets in, perhaps we should stick with a dictator who, after all, is our dictator.
Sure. Well, to make democracy really work, you really need not just a degree of order and stability. You want to make sure that the winners are not only recognised, but the losers are recognised. And that means that the losers in a democratic process are guaranteed untrammeled rights and civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, an impartial judiciary. The opposition has to be loyal, in other words. I don't think you have that culture right now. The other disturbing thing here is that history is littered with a lot of examples where the most unsavoury groups will exploit political chaos and try to use elections as a way of legitimacy for authoritarianism and extremism. And let's not forget, a democratic process brought Chancellor Hitler in 1933. We've seen the democratic process in much of the Middle East, where a government in Gaza is led by Hamas, which has been regarded as a terrorist organisation. 6 years ago, we had the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, but it's now pretty much run by the Hezbollah, and things have not really improved. So I'm just more sceptical about whether democracy can actually work in some of these countries. It takes time, it takes evolution, and one of the problems with the Mubarak government, of course, is that it hasn't done much in the way of political reform. 5, 6 years ago, it talked about having some elections, and there were elections, but by most accounts, they were probably rigged. They've propped up this regime. It has been propped up for some time, but I think it's wise to remember that the Middle Eastern order has been a brutal, thuggish, but more or less stable regime for the last 50 years.
But terminal now, surely.
Well, but the danger now, of course, is that it's not just going to be brutal and thuggish, but also unstable. And I don't think one should underestimate that instability can quickly get out of control.
How inevitable is a change, do you think, Peter Lewis? I mean, we have the army now making this declaration that they won't act with force against demonstrators. It'd be interesting to see what the Defence Minister Tantawi actually made in order to drive them from the streets. But what are you hearing about the level of persistence 8 days in from those who are on the streets in Cairo?
There's an element here that hasn't really been picked up in a lot of the Western media reports, which is before the Muslim Brotherhood moved in on this protest movement, it was actually being driven by small groups of independent trade unions, workers from individual industries that aren't recognised by the Egyptian government. They've been becoming increasingly active over the last 12 months. And today is actually a general strike. It's not a million-man march. That's the branding of it. But it's actually a general strike. And it's just not... It's being run by unions that haven't been sponsored by the state. This is really interesting because there are two ways that this democracy, if it is a democracy movement, can go. One, it's driven by the mosques. The other is it's driven by the workplaces. Now, traditionally in places like the Middle East, particularly during the Cold War, America and the West made the call that it was safer to have democracy movements driven through religion than through what was then communist-driven workplaces. Without communism, it's an interesting dynamic how this is going to unfold. I just think that this is much more... It's being called the rudderless revolution at the moment, but there are lots of small groups of workers that are right at the centre of this, and how it plays out over the next day, I think it's going to be really interesting.
Karagrano, governments across the region are nervous. I saw that even Hamas stopped a rally in Gaza today that was going to express solidarity for the Egyptian demonstrations. Do you worry that this could ignite other copycat uprisings, intifada across the region?
I don't think I worry about that. What I do think is more that this is an opportunity. Unlike Tom, I'm actually probably more positive about this. I don't see the Muslim Brotherhood to be as bad as a lot of people are making them out to be. They're not even a terrorist organisation as deemed by the United States government, and let's be honest, they're happy to deem a lot of people terrorist organisations, you know, somewhat willy-nilly. They've denounced violence, and they've come out today in The Guardian and said, we're not after seizing power right now, we're after democracy. So I see the domino effect being a positive thing. Yes, there'll be instability. If I was Israeli, yes, I would be nervous, but I think from a global perspective, I think this is a positive thing.
I would disturb that bit of harmony there, Cara, by saying that the Muslim Brotherhood is indeed a terrorist organisation. It's a strong supporter of Hamas, it's a strong supporter of Hezbollah, it's a strong opponent of the Camp David peace accords from 1979, which is the linchpin of the Middle East peace.
If it tore up that peace treaty with Israel, what would happen at, say, a border like Gaza?
Well, that's exactly right. These are the unknown unknowns. We can only fear the worst, and I mean that seriously. But also, we don't even know what their position is on the Suez Canal, which is a gateway of trade. And also, domestically, a lot of the spokespeople, sure, they're biting their tongues now, but a lot of them have said some nasty things about the rights of women, Christians, Jews and homosexuals. I don't think it's a savoury regime at all.
Let's look at how this, for now, let's look at how this demonstration is being organised. I mean, some old technology is, in the end, helping people in Egypt to stay connected in the midst of talking about a Twitter revolution. Google has responded to the internet blockade of the country by creating a way to post messages to the microblogger Twitter, leaving voicemail messages on special phone numbers. Social networking expert Ingrid Volkmar says it's a new use of established technology.
Service is quite interesting because it's using, in a way, old media telephone landlines for people to make these calls to these international platforms where there messages, their voice messages are then transformed into tweets, into short messages, which are posted automatically on Twitter.
Well, Egypt's last working internet service provider, the Noor Group, went down today, leaving the nation entirely offline. Cara Grino, we've also heard from Deutsche Press Agentur in Egypt that mobile phone services will be cut before this march of millions today. Tell me, is it possible to organise a decent intifada these days if you don't have Twitter, SMS and Facebook?
Yeah, old school. It kicks in old school, and it's simply just, from what I've read, people going from neighbour to neighbour. Egyptian whispers, if you like. And I think that it's obviously much easier with technology, but the will of the people is so strong on this that I think that even with the internet down, and if they can disrupt the mobile phone services, they will still get, maybe not 1 million people, but the trade unions and everything else, I think they'll be able to organise themselves.
Just play into the hands of your grassroots sort of
Exactly. I think that we fall into the trap of overhyping the role of new technology when the latest revolution comes online. This is being driven by grassroots. This is a real groundswell. It's not something that's being facilitated by 140 characters.
I mean, it's a bit like the old adage that the war after the next one will be fought with bows and arrows. It looks like the uprising after the Twitter revolution is going to be fought with crystal sets and shortwave radios.
Yeah, well, Cara might be right about Afghanistan, but bear in mind, 18 months ago we had the same talk about a Twitter revolution in Iran. And what happened there? Ahmadinejad still pretty much consolidated power, and there's no
and they trace the tweets back to the senders in many cases to persecute
and what's happened to those people. So in many respects, this technology is a double-edged sword.
The regime is now following you.
Is that your friend?